accommodate our rescheduling.
26, 27, Tzadikim in Stom. 29, 30. Thanks, Autumn.
Okay. The live stream has started. We're just letting some people come in.
Something is flickering.
Yeah, what exactly is flickering? And if it's Rabbi Bogart, we're okay with that.
I see no flickering.
I don't, yeah.
It's Nishmat Kol Chai. Yeah, that's flickering.
Okay, well, if you are having any technical difficulties, put some more about that in the chat and we'll try to figure all of that out. I'm gonna start by saying a repeat of Shana Tova, Happy New Year to everybody. Shavua Tova, good week, even as there is good Yontif coming up soon. This funny week that we're having here. But thank you all for joining us. Apologies again for all of you who were with us last Tuesday when we had some technical difficulties that ended the webinar very abruptly. We promise you it was not because of Rabbi Bennett's Torah, which was wonderful, or because of what Rabbi Bogard was about to say, which will also be wonderful. Although if this cuts out right before you start, Daniel, then it is Min HaShamayim and like
exactly.
So,
I think it's because he's in his sukkah too early.
Yeah,
that's why.
Exactly. So anyway, we're glad to have all of you join us and to continue in our discussions. We come together as colleagues, all of whom have studied together separately, but kind of alongside one another or on similar paths with the Hartman Institute. Coming across different denominations and from different places, just to grapple with some deep questions that we see facing our community, facing our world, facing our own Jewish lives. And I'm going to pass the floor to Rabbi Rose, who is our facilitator today.
Thank you so much. As always, well done, Maharat Rory. That's a great introduction. In fact, I'm so excited to be able to be with you. And I just wanted to share a little tale, a Ma'aseh Shehaya, an actual event. After Rabbi Bennett taught a very short but poignant Torah last week, I actually came across something that I shared with him as well, and I shared it with all of my colleagues. And it seemed to me that we realized that our Torah is so impactful, and in fact, it impacts on our lives on a daily basis. And in the things that we learn together, we're able to apply it to the rest of our lives. And so it was just one of those moments when we were able to share Torah, and I hope that we'll continue to do that publicly and privately as well, and continue to provide inspirational grist for our spiritual mills. So we decided that we would try to do something a little different. This is my crazy idea, so I take full responsibility for it, to ask each of the facilitators to share a Torah which is an ikar, an essential Torah for them, a Torah that fuels the holy work that each of us performs. And so last time we were together, Rabbi Bennett started us off, and I thank him for doing that, being the elder sage on the Zoom. And we're going to ask him today, since some of us were unable to make it or got cut off, to kind of recap very quickly what it is that he was able to share with us so beautifully. And I've written it down, and I will steal it, as they say in the Gemara, Hagonev mehaganav patur. If you steal Torah from somebody else who stole it, which means we've got it from our teachers, right? I'm sure the Torah that we've learned, we've shared in all wide variety of ways. At least I know I have. We are not culpable, but we are absolutely happy to share it. And then after Rabbi Bennett is finished with his teaching, we will turn it over to Rabbi Bogard, and then we will hand it off. And hopefully we'll finish sometime before or around 4 o'clock today. Okay, so Rabbi, the floor is yours, and thank you all for being with us. And once again, Shana Tova.
Thank you, Rabbi, and thank you to everybody for being here on this Erev Chag. And I just want to very briefly summarize what I shared last week, that actually is among my ikarim, one of my essential understandings of Torah that I didn't actually steal, although I have permanently borrowed it. It's on permanent loan from the prophet Micah, who I first encountered as a child, as I was preparing for becoming a bar mitzvah, when my rabbi assigned me the parashah of my Torah portion and my haftarah in the summer of 1971. And I was really even then blown away by the wisdom of the prophet Micah, chapter 6, verse 8, where he asks and answers a question. What is it that God requires of you, O human? What is it that God demands or expects of us as human beings? Only, Micah says, what is good. Only to do justice, only to love chesed, to love kindness and compassion, only to walk with humility in the presence of God. And even as a soon-to-be 13-year-old back then, I was really moved by the simplicity and the clarity of Micah's message. And in subsequent years, I've, I think, incorporated it even more into my work. And I'd like to believe, although I can't be the judge of this, I think others have to judge us by the way they experience us, and ultimately God judges us in the way we have lived our lives. But I'd like to believe that I can hold this as a measuring stick by which to live my life. And when I shared last week the insights of the rabbinic tradition and the centuries of Jewish tradition trying to understand this, I brought from Talmud a little piece of Gemara, as Rory pointed out accurately, not the entire Gemara, but just a small piece of the Gemara that really helps us to understand that these acts of tzedek, of working towards justice, these acts of chesed, of kindness, of loving kindness, and caring about other people in our lives, and especially these acts of humility, are both specific deeds. They are things, as the Talmud teaches, to do things that are real in the world, but also they're things, perhaps most importantly, that we can't get credit for. There are things that have to be done with humility in private, and not when there's a benefit, not in a transactional nature, but rather that we should just live this way. We should strive to the best of our ability to work for justice, not because we get something out of it, and to be kind, not only because then others will be kind to us. And we should walk with humility, even when nobody's watching, even when, or maybe especially when nobody's watching, that we can strive to aspire to this great standard of what it means to be good, what it means to be human. And that's my Torah. And on that foundation, maybe we can build the rest of the Torah of my colleagues. So I'll turn it over now to you, Rabbi Bogart, Daniel, to share your Torah as well.
Thanks, Jim. And thank you for that piece last week. I had not encountered that before. Really have been struck by it. Yeah. I'm going to share one of my favorite texts today, and a text that I feel like describes the core of what my rabbinate is about. I know this will come as no surprise to anyone that it's a particularly subversive midrash, I think, and that it totally, I see you laughing at me there, Carney.
I'm laughing with you.
With totally. It really takes a story that we're quite familiar with, the story of Avram and his first interactions with God, really the beginning of the Jewish story. We think about it, right? The first 11 chapters of the Torah deal with humanity's story, and everything else is about the Jews. So I thought we'd start by looking at the version that we have in the Torah. Everyone can see this? Is this coming through? Now Hashem said to Avram, go forth from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. Right? This is the very beginning of chapter 12, Lech Lecha. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the ones who curse you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So really familiar text here. I want to talk a little bit about subject and object before we go on to this midrash here. So just as a reminder, the object is what the subject acts on in our grammar, right? So Rory hit Jim. Rory is the sorry, Rory. Rory is the subject doing the action, and Jim is the object.
Deserved
the
it,
action.
though.
Yeah. That's the rest of the story. Yeah, what Jim did. Yeah. So Jim becomes the object, the thing being acted upon. What we get here in the original version of this text is Abraham very much as the object. Right? We don't get any reasons for why God has entered into history to interact with Abraham. We don't find out what Abraham has done to warrant this or to deserve this. And of course, the Midrash picks this up in all sorts of different places. But Abraham is very much the object being acted on here by God in order for God to bring a plan into the world. So with that as a setup, I want to look at this Midrash because this Midrash totally undermines and subverts that idea. So we get the same beginning, right? The jumping off line.
Daniel,
Yeah,
can you just like zoom a little bit more? I think it just might be a little easier to read if you just make it, because
totally.
I have a lot of white space on either side of your screen. Yeah, that's great.
Okay, here's our Midrash. Hashem said to Avram, go forth from your land. Rabbi Yitzchak said, this may be compared to a person who was traveling from place to place when they saw a birad doleket, a castle full of flames, castle on fire. So I'm going to translate it here. They said, is it possible that this castle lacks a person to look after it? The owner of the building looked out and said, I am the owner of the castle. Similarly, it was because Abraham, our father, Avraham Avinu, said, is it possible that this castle has no guide, no one to look after it? That the Holy Blessed One looked out and said to him, I am the master of the universe. Hence God said to Abraham, Lech Lecha. So I want to start by just looking at the total flip that we have of subject and object. Because here, what's happened is that we're imagining, first of all, a world on fire, right? Which, I don't know about you all, is something very relatable for me, this idea that our world is on fire. And yet, the setup is that everyone who lives in the area has been presumably going past it and is just so used to seeing this castle on fire that they treat it that that's the nature of castles. They're supposed to be on fire, right? This very much has resonance to me in terms of the Me Too movement, in terms of Black Lives Matter movement, in terms of all sorts of social movements that have helped us to see the brokenness of our world in ways that we are raised to just imagine is how it is, right? The mistake of thinking the way that things are is the way that they should be, which is such a human mistake, right? And so that's the setup, is that there are these people walking by who live there, presumably, who are just used to it being on fire, until someone who's not used to it being on fire comes by and says something and interrupts and points out that this thing is burning down and we have to do something about it. This is very much that inversion of subject and object, right? This is an imagining that says that the reason God steps into history is because Abraham steps up and says the world is broken, the world is on fire, and something has to be done about it, which is to say that we have to do the work of calling out injustice where we see it, of calling out the brokenness where we see it, and that it's through that work that we begin to bring holiness, that we bring the divine into the world. Not the other way around. So I will call that my teaching here, and would love to hear thoughts from the three of you, from my colleagues.
First, Daniel, first of all, I know you and I learned this text together in the same place in Yerushalayim, and I've loved it ever since we first learned it. I just to be a little ornery, perhaps not as much because I believe what I'm about to say, but because it seems to me to be a legitimate reading of the text. It seems that there are at least two possibilities. One is that the role of Avraham, as this text seems to teach, is to, as you just said, to call out injustice, to note it, to draw attention to it. But it could be that that's where the end of our responsibility lies. It seems that you're extrapolating already and adding like the next Midrash, which we don't have yet, which says, Lech Lecha doesn't mean only call out the fact that the castle is on fire, but actually go do something about it. But the Midrash never says that. It never says put out the fire. The Midrash just says God needs us to tell the world that the fire is burning, right? So that's the part of this that's theologically troubling, is why does God need us to point out the obvious, which is that the world is on fire?
Yeah, I always think of this as also, I mean, there's the obvious connection to the burning bush. But the other connection I think that I always make is to that beginning of the story in Exodus, right? Where God hears our groaning, and this is the beginning of action. And, so much of this is the lesson, and I don't mean to overdo the connection here, but so much of this is that lesson of Me Too and of Black Lives Matter, and of the idea that it has to start with a recognition of reality, that action has to start with seeing the world as it is and seeing the brokenness and calling it out and helping other people to see the brokenness. So yeah, no, I would never suggest that this is the end point. And I totally hear your read on this text. I guess for me, a lot of this is simply, that's also how I understand my rabbinate. That's how I understand a lot of the work that I do. We can't do it all.
So I'm so in love with this text. And I want to say I used to teach this text before Hartman was teaching. Like, now Hartman made it popular and I can't teach it anymore, but because I love this text though. But one of the things, like, to build on what you both just said, is that one of the things that resonates with me is that I find in this Midrash an echo of the story of Moshe's leadership also, right? Like, the moment that Moshe becomes a leader is also when something's on fire, right? So I feel like literally, right, it's not just that Abraham sees something broken, he sees something on fire. So who else does that? Like, immediately I jump to Moses. And I think there's something really profound in that story, because it's really explicit, where Moses is walking by and he sees this bush aflame but not being consumed. And he says, right, the text says that he says, let me turn to look at this wondrous sight, right? And that's when God calls out to him. And I think it's, I think Ramban, Nachmanides, actually has like a reading of it where he actually says, like, right, because it's an interesting, the text is ambiguous. Is the bush on fire for Moses, or is the bush on fire and Moses is the first one who stops to see it, right? Which I think, like, this Midrash, exactly what you said, Daniel, right? Like, this castle was always aflame. Abraham was just the one who was like, is someone in charge of this? Because, like, we need to do something about it. Right, so Moses, and I think there's something to be said for these two people who, right, like the founder of monotheism and the founder of the Jewish people, right, like these forefathers that we have, that what really is at the core of their leadership is not like battle, right? It's not about their strength, although they both do ultimately go into battle, but that actually, like, leadership starts with looking. Like, and I think, to Jim's point, right, like, the looking ultimately leads them to action. But I think that there's like this theme within our tradition to say that leadership is not about who's the strongest. It's about saying, I need to look at this, and I need, and not only that, but I would say also there's like a willingness. It's a looking, it's an asking a question, and then it's an openness to the answer, right? Like, Abraham says, is someone in charge? And that's when he can hear God's voice. And Moses says, like what's like, there's this wondrous sight, what's going on? And that's when he can hear God, right? It's when we are willing to see the world differently, question it, but also not go in saying, I know what to do, but actually say, I need to be open to this experience. And then suddenly the unexpected, right? That's when God says to Moses, take off your shoes.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you. And
Yeah,
wondrous
beautiful.
and wonderful. I'm going to add just maybe a slightly different kvetch, right? A fatach. I want to make sure that we at least give voice to the notion that this Birad Doleket is not a burning building that's on fire and aflame and in the midst of destruction. I went there first as well. From the first time I learned this Midrash, and subsequently, and even through my time at Hartman. But I actually say that over the course of time, I've softened on this Midrash a little bit, and maybe it'll be a nice introduction to where I'm going to go after Maharat Rory teaches. But this notion of that the world is aglow, that the world has within it the power not only to burn down, but to warm. And that's the recognition that Avraham sees. Birad Oleket doesn't mean necessarily a building on fire, right? We understand we can make that claim, right? Here's Rabbi Bogart sitting in the sun. God bless his soul. I hope he doesn't turn out as at the end of the story of Yonah, right? But he's in the blazing sun. We know that experience. We know that the global warming that's happening. That's the direction we're going. But what about the possibility of a global warming of a different sort? That what Avraham Avinu really sees is that there is an energy, a power in the universe that provides for the opportunity for the warmth that comes from love and concern and consideration. And therefore, he's moved to action by this to be one of those people, right? Avraham is machnis orchim. He's a person who brings people into his tent. Here we are on the eve of Sukkot, a time when we really are supposed to extend hachnasat orchim, if we can, safely in this COVID era, to be together. Right, to have people who come into the Silta Dehemnuta, right, into the shade of faith in a rickety booth, that we can show people that there is a power in the universe that allows for that power that makes for the salvation, right? The power that makes for the notion that things can be all right, that it's within our grasp not only to recognize fires that need to be put out, but rather that fires that need to be flamed, to fanned, to flame it up, right, to increase the flame, that warmth. So I just want to be able to name that as part of this conversation as well, that for me in my subversive reading, right, is not that it's on fire, but rather that it's warm. Now, what will we do with that warmth? That there is a little pintaliyid, right, or there's a little fire that's lit. What will we do with it, right? Will we ignore it as most people did as they pass by? Will they see it on fire? Oh my God, I have to do something. I'll go run the buckets, get the water, right? Or do we see it as something that needs to be fanned so that we can create a warmth, a loving, an embracing Jewish tradition or religious tradition that can be shared with anybody who wants to come and get close, right? The notion of a fire in the midst of the night, right, that warms and glows and provides direction. So I want to make sure that we name that as well, because that really is one of my favorite readings of it as well. And again, I jumped like most of us, I think, to maybe that's us. We're fire people, right? We immediately want to take care of things. We're gonna make it better. We're gonna fix it. But maybe it's all there already. Maybe that's what the great vision of Avraham Avinu was. Hey, it's all there. We just have to recognize it and know how to use it. Will we use it to burn things down, or we think to light things up, or to destroy or to warm?
I love that read, Carney. And I love that read that it's a palace aglow rather than a palace on fire. And I think either read still locates the obligation with human initiative and our fundamental responsibility to each other and to the world.
Right. It's not, man in search of God, right? It's God in search of humanity, or at least that dual. And I think Rory put something really important. Of course, both are there. I think it's a really important point that you're clarifying for us, Rory, that they're both there. It's not just that humans are searching for God. It's that I think at least the God that I believe in, or the God that I'm trying to believe in, is a God who desperately is searching for the partnership with us and gives us all kinds of signals and signs. And yes, it could be a building that's burning down, right? A world that's burning itself, that's destroying itself. On the other hand, it could be a world that has within it those potential moments. And maybe I'm just feeling it today, because today in particular, there's some things that happened in my world of sensitivities, of considerations, of love, of generosity, of spirit that just warmed the cockles of my heart. I can know another way in which to say it. So Rabbi Bennett, please.
No, it's beautiful. And I think that concept of both and rather either or is important, because I don't want to minimize the fact that in that world which is burning with such potentiality and such creativity, and that we can actualize if only we look at it the way this teaching you shared urges us to. There may be those who are burning and need to be rescued from the midst of the flames. And I mean, not there may be, there are those who are burning, and we cannot lose sight of one or the other. So often that's where this divisive world we're living in takes us. You have to commit all to one point of view or all to the other. And I think this either or both and teaching is, for me at least, is the most powerful message of this beautiful text that you brought.
That's wonderful. Can I ask as the moderator, just do you see your rabbit? And since that's the question, and Mary Bogart, maybe I'll start with you because you brought this beautiful text, but do you see yourself doing one or the other more often? I know it's both. Rory pointed that on an important point, that it's both. But in your rabbinate, do you find yourself more often than not a person who's putting out fire or a person who's lighting fires? You know what I mean? Warming fires, or are we trying to put out all the negative and fight against and railing against the negativity? And I'd just like each of us maybe to comment on that, because I think that's a key conversation that might help folks appreciate our rabbinates.
I'm struggling with this, Carney. My initial inclination was to say that I find myself seeing the world on fire more than I see it aglow, particularly these last few years, and I can see that change in me. But then I also feel like I've, in many ways, leaned into the possibilities of Judaism in this COVID era too, and what we can create and who we can reach, and the sorts of folks we can connect with, and the possibilities of community. So I don't know. I'm going to go with the and here. Yeah.
I wasn't asking us to make a choice. I was asking, is there a dagesh chazak? In other words, is there one? Do you find yourself in your rabbinate having an emphasis on one or the other at particular moments? And just to give, to belie my own orientation here, I think there was a time in my rabbinate where I spent a lot of my time being a firefighter, right? I was going to fight all the things that were wrong. And I realized that my reach was very limited by only having, I was like a one-trick pony. And I had to develop that other side, which is, by the way, I think my natural inclination is to be much more loving, but I had to fight against type. I think even trained in rabbinical school to fight against type, to not lead with my heart, but to lead with my head. That may belie a little bit about the nature of the education I received in the seminary that I attended, right? Was to lead with the head and not the heart. And so that I'm coming around at this next stage in my rabbinate and 25 years in to returning to that essential Birah Doleket as a warming, a glowing Judaism. Rabbi Bennett, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I was it was a really fascinating question, and your answer actually caught me a little off guard, because what I was about to say, your answer, Carney, Rabbi Rose, because I was about to say that actually the exact opposite has been my experience. I was drawn to become a rabbi, and maybe this is a generational thing, maybe it's a movement thing, I don't know. But I was drawn to become a rabbi first and foremost because of the role of pastor and of healer and of helper and of carer. And that's what actually attracted me greatly to the rabbinate, to be able to be in a profession where I could teach and care for and bring the beautiful values of Judaism to bear upon people. And much of my rabbinate really has focused on that role. And I would say, to answer your specific question, I spend much more of my time as a rabbi doing the warming and the caring and the healing, and always have. And I think that's an essential, that's the ikar of my rabbinate. Over the years, and I don't know whether this is about me or whether it's about the world or whether it's about Judaism or about the rabbinate or maybe all of the above, I have found myself drawn much, much more to the putting out fire role, to the tzedek role, to that. And now I actually literally just wrote a little note to myself over the last few days that, Congregation Sharmith and much of the Reform movement has been focused over the last, 10 years or so on this project of the Reform movement in the URJ called Moving Justice to the Center, which has been an impulse to say tzedek is at the very center. And I wrote a little note to myself and asked myself, is tzedek really at the center? Or is chesed at the center of tzedek, which is really at the center? In other words, I I think what I've learned in my rabbinate is I was drawn to this work because of Chesed, and I am compelled to this work because of Tzedek, and they have to both be there. And I now feel more than ever that I can't do one without the other any more than I could do, I have to have my heart and my brain, I have to have my hands and my body in the work that I do.
I think that's just really beautifully said. Maybe it's like the contrarian in me, but I really do feel I feel like I like waver in it. I feel like depending on what it is that like is facing me, I probably do the opposite, in the sense that I find like when people feel like when people are coming at me to tell me something's on fire, I'm like, no, like we're all aglow, and when people are all aglow, I'm like, you're missing the fire. I think there's something about to me, there's something about the rabbinate that's meant to give comfort when people are uncomfortable, but also make us uncomfortable when we're too comfortable. Maybe not just the rabbinate, but Judaism, right? Like I think we're sort of called, when I did a program years ago with American Jewish World Service, where I think it was Aaron Dorfman. He kind of coined this, this I forget now exactly, but the sweet spot of trying to get people, you would call it productive discomfort, right? The sense that if you get people to be too comfortable, right? Like if you tell people a problem, you say like, the world's on fire, but people are working on it. Everyone's like, great, so I'll just stay home. Like, let me know when you fix it. It's, good people are doing it, right? But if you tell people like the world's on fire and we're all going to die tomorrow, people are like, I'm just going to hide under my bed, right? And you need to like keep people in that right balance of like, the world's on fire and you can do something about it, and we need you to like, right? Like, and that's like what I strive for, right? I strive for like that right balance of how do we stay just uncomfortable enough that we're productive, and just productive enough that we stay uncomfortable, we don't become complacent. And and so sometimes that kind of depends on like whatever, right? When that person gets to be too far in any extreme, we got to pull them back. But I think, right, like we're not supposed to just settle for what is. I think that a lot of the Jewish tradition is saying that we should be always dreaming of what could be.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to add just one little teaching before we go on to the next, and it's really just two words, because I'm hearing it in the ways in which we're teaching. We call this ikarim, essential teachings that fuel the work that we do. And this year we're using a lot of Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav in our teaching in the shul. And Rabbi Nachman has a term that I've actually never seen in anybody else's writings. He says, Ve'ha'ikar ve'haklal, right next to each other. In other words, ve'haklal kama ve'ha'ikar, or ve'ha'ikar ve'haklal, which means what? Which means the essential teaching on the one hand, which leads to a general orientation, right? Ikar is essential, klal is more general. And he uses those two words right next to one another, right? Adjacent to one another in the very same sentence. And one of the things that I think I'm hearing in this conversation is, yes, these are ikarim, these are essential teachings for us, but they don't lead us to essentialize in a negative way. They lead us to actually be much broader and bigger than ourselves. In other words, when Rabbi Bennett started with what we thought was a relatively small orientation, right? These three basic things, halavai, right? Like if it was just these three things, it would be amazing. But then the way in which we're playing with this is actually what? This fuels everything that we do. Is it tzedek or is it chesed? Or is the chesed inside the tzedek, or the tzedek inside the chesed, right? It's like that Russian doll kind of concept of the way in which we're unpacking it. And I've heard it from Rabbi Bogart here as well in his discussion, right? And now we've taken it to a whole nother place, right? So we see something, it's a fire, it's a glow, is it warming, is it burning? What is it pushing us? Is it inspiring us? Is it making us sort of sit back and say, oh my God, it's on fire. What am I going to do about it? Like a complacency? There's so much that happens as we begin to look both at essential teachings and then how they move us from this very small place to a much broader place. So v'ha'ikar v'haklal, right? It's essential, but it's very, very, very big and very, very broad. And so I found that to be a really important teaching for me from Rabbi Nachman, who I've studied for years, but have never seen that that way. And by the way, just the context for the teaching originally was, but kol ha'ulam kulo, the whole world is a narrow bridge, right? V'ha'ikar v'ha'klal, he says, right? It's essential, but it's the principle that one should not have too much fear to the point where one cannot move forward. And so I want to make sure that we have that too in equal measure. I want the fire to move me. I want the fire to feel like it's urgent, but I also want to do it in a way that can be comforting and quieting and not so disquieting, right? That a person feels that they are profoundly in a position where they can do absolutely nothing because it's just so overwhelming. Maharaj Rory, unless there's another comment here,
I was just going to jump in and say I'm struggling with Jim, struggling in a positive way. You're sort of looking at on fire versus a glow as being pastoral versus prophetic roles within the rabbinate. And I guess what I'm struck by, I put this in the chat too, is how often the pastoral moments are responses to the world being on fire, right? Showing up in a hospital room is almost always a response to someone's world being on fire. So I don't know, I'm kind of struggling with those reckonings.
Reb Daniel, I think just the piece that's for me that's so important is if I walk in there on fire too, then I don't do anything positive or constructive. So we need to know how to be that non-anxious posture in the time when people are in modes of anxiety, right? And when we're in modes of anxiety or people in the postures of inaction, we may have to create a sense of anxiety, right? Rory's getting at this, right? I think before that the notion that religion is really there to quiet the disturbed and to disturb the quiet, right? And those are really powerful ideas. And this text for me, I would never have thought about it in that way until you brought it today, but it's really such a great example of the boldness of what our holy work has to be about. And there are moments when we have to let people know it. And, reality or shock therapy is not something I necessarily want to do, but every once in a while, I do it to myself too, like hold up the mirror, right? So I'm saying to people like, hold up the mirror, okay? Take a look. Is this really what this is about? Or have you thought about it from this perspective? Or is this really you who's saying this? Or is this something else that you're spouting off about that sounds good, but isn't really you? And those are conversations I'm sure that we've all had many, many, many times with people in our rabbinates. So, Rabbi, any closing shots? Very good. Maharat Rory, it's all you.
Thank you. Oh, this was so great. And I'm going in a totally different direction on this. So this is about to get really interesting. So, I don't have permission to share my screen. May I get that from somebody? We had done all the tech check before the last webinar.
You should be good now.
While you're doing that, by the way, Autumn, I hope that you have my text still that you were going to share on my behalf. I hope so. Bezrat Hashem.
I have a message that Autumn's having trouble with their computers, and I have it waiting for me, Carney, so I will pull it up.
Thank God for you.
Can you see this? Okay. So here's what I want to share, and I'm looking at it on my second screen, so sorry if it looks like I'm staring off in the distance for all of you. But this is one of my favorite texts. This was the text that I taught at my ordination ceremony. And it's a Midrash that is right. So for those of you who are familiar, Midrash are always asking questions about the text. And so this Midrash is in the story when the Israelites are standing at the foot of the mountain about to receive the 10 commandments, right? God's about to speak these 10 commandments. And it says in the Torah, it says, "Vaydaber Elokim et kol hadavarim ha'ela lemor." God spoke all these words saying. So the rabbis are always deeply uncomfortable with why do any extraneous words, right? And so anytime you have a pasuk where you don't need to say God spoke all these words saying, like, of course God spoke all these words, God spoke these words, right? That would have been sufficient. There has to be more to this word all. So they're going to ask this question about it. And so Rabbi Yitzchak says, what are all these words? That which the prophets were to prophesy in all future generations was received at Mount Sinai. As Moses said to Israel, but both with those who are standing here with us this day before the Lord our God and with those who are not with us here this day. It doesn't say those who are not standing with us here, but rather those who are not with us refers to the souls who are to be created in the future. Since they don't have any substance, they're not going to be standing. Right, so this like plays off. Some of you might have heard this, right? This like everybody was standing at Sinai. Daniel and I actually, right, our children. I was actually just talking about this last night, Daniel, with a Hindu friend. But right, when our sons met at the beginning of second grade, right, 3 years ago, they both came home and they said, "I've met him before." And I, like, with my interfaith work, was like, I don't know, this is like reincarnation. Daniel, of course, being much holier, said they saw each other at Sinai. Like, of course, that's where you see everyone. Right. So we have this kind of concept, right? And this is where this idea that everyone's standing at Sinai, but it says something more profound, not just that we were all there at Sinai, but it says this that I think is just so crucial for me. It says, in that moment, each and every person received their share of the Torah. Right? Not just that we were standing at Sinai, but we received our share of the Torah. And first they say that this has to do with prophecy, because it says, like, they use these examples. In Malachi, it says the word of the Lord to Israel through Malachi. It doesn't say in the days of Malachi, but through Malachi, because the prophecy was already with him. He had already received this prophecy at Sinai, but until that moment, he was not given permission to prophesy. Right? I love this image. I love this image that every person has some Torah within them, some Torah that is somehow built or connected inside of them, but that it is only in the moment when we are able to release it into the world that it suddenly becomes realized, right? But it actually, right, it connects all the way back to Sinai. And then, of course, the sages in their great sage wisdom say, not only did all of the prophets receive their prophecy at Sinai, but so too, so too all the sages who arise in each generation, each and every one received their share of the Torah at Sinai. I'll stop sharing so I can look at all of you again, right? To me, like, what this text does a few different things. One is, I think on the simplest level, it connects all of us back to Sinai, right? Like, what I'm saying now, I didn't just make up. Like, what are you talking about, right? Like, this was always at Sinai, right? This was always what God intended. I'm actually speaking the words that God spoke at Sinai, and it's just that it was waiting for this moment in the year 2021, in this context, to somehow come into like kind of manifestation. And so there's something, and I think the sages especially, because they get really creative and they kind of make up new stuff, right? So they have to connect to it. But I actually think there's something to me that's so much more profound, of this realization that every person has this share of Torah, and we need them to release it, right? Because to me, right, what it also means is that there's people in the world who don't have the opportunity. And part of that connected to me, particularly in terms of women's leadership. I think we can have this conversation in terms of LGBTQ Jews, in terms of Jews of color, in terms of disabled Jews, older singles, right? There's all these populations that we've kind of kept out of our communal spaces, not necessarily each of us, right? But like as a community have been kept out. And in that, right, we've kept Torah out because every person has a share of Torah that they were given at Sinai that's waiting for them to come along to realize it. And so for me, I just think like how different to go through the world knowing that everybody has a unique portion of Torah, right? It's not just that we all have access to Torah, but actually each of us was given. So, and I feel this especially profoundly, and I think about it even in this context, right? So I taught this, I said, at my ordination, and after I was ordained, like, I don't know, people sort of treated me differently, right? Suddenly, like I was clergy and right, as if I knew more answers, and I knew nothing. I still feel like I know nothing, right? I know a few more quotes, right? Like I have weird hobbies, so I can quote a Midrash maybe, maybe by heart a little bit more than other people, right? But for me, like that's what I keep coming back to. That's not Torah, right? Like Torah is what we extrapolate, and I feel like a big part of my rabbinate has been, how do I empower everybody to manifest their Torah? Because I can't bring out someone else's Torah, right? Like I only have what was given to me, and other people have what was given to them. And we need to create the environment where everybody has the opportunity to actually bring their Torah into that manifestation, because without it, we're missing part of the Torah that was given to us.
That's beautiful. Whew. So reactions, Rabbi Bogard, Rabbi Bennett, any reactions you'd like to share on this powerful teaching from Maharat Rory?
That's beautiful, Rory, really. And I I teach this Midrash every first meeting I have with a conversion candidate. It's one of my sort of traditions for those meetings, but I never teach that second part. And I love that. I love that second part, and I'm going to add it in. This idea that, right, the part of the question is, our Torah is not complete until they also share it. And until we create a world where everyone can share their Torah.
I love that.
Yeah, I just add my own voice. I share the same reaction. It's beautiful. It's also very aspirational. And unfortunately, and this is my sadness hearing you teach this, it's not actualized in our Jewish communities very well. There seems to be a lot of my Torah is right to the exclusion of your Torah. So you need to listen to my Torah because I have exclusive or more accurate ownership of Torah. And I think I'm not being accusatory when I say that. I think that is the case of all of us to some degree, that we tend to think our Torah is the right Torah. And when this is very inclusive, that we need all of our Torah in order for to get anywhere. Everybody's voice is needed in the Jewish community.
Yeah, no, and I think you're right. I mean, I think you're right. And I think I remember when I was in college, I was actually dating Russell, my husband at the time, with some friends. We all decided, I was going to college in Manhattan. I was living in Brooklyn, and we decided to all spend Shabbat together in Brooklyn. My dad was going out of town. My mom was going to be on her own. But in any case, so I grew up in a good, like at this very, very like, it was not like a welcome, right? I mean, we loved the congregation, but it was sort of like an insider's congregation. And I said, and they said, well, let's find some other place to go to. And so we went to this place. I don't know. My mom said, I heard there's this nice congregation. We went, and they were really welcoming and, said hi. And I remember one of my friends said, if Russell gets an Aliyah right now, like we're all paying membership right now. I'll date myself in saying, right, like this was during the Terry Schiavo controversy, right? If you remember the days of, right, where everyone was debating if right, her husband wanted to take her off the feeding tube and her parents did not. I believe that was the way that it was. And the rabbi got up. I didn't know this rabbi at all. He got up and he said, here's this really controversial thing. And he said, people are, everyone's debating it. And he goes, the Torah says there's one clear answer, and I'm about to tell you what it is. And I said, I'm done. Like, anyone who tells me that the Torah gives you one answer, like, to me, didn't study Torah. Like, I mean, even at that point, I said, never mind, like, we're like, forget the membership we were about to pay. Like, and to me, though, like, part of it is also the recognition, I think, within this is that not that the Torah kind of changes, right? But like, if the Torah is true and eternal, then it has to be true in all times and all contexts, which means that we're going to have a different lens, right? Like, we're going to see the Torah differently. And I know for me, when I was giving a sermon in the pulpit every year, I would look back and I realized that I was giving a sermon one year on one Torah portion, and the next year I gave the exact opposite sermon, right? Like, I can give a sermon for why Noah is a hero one year and why Noah, was terrible the next year, or whatever it is. And I realized it was just because of where I was, right? And not because the story changed, but because I had changed. And I think that's also part of this, right? It's this recognition that like the Torah is given, and yet, each of us is going to see it differently in the year 2021 with everything that we've, we've all seen the Torah differently now that we've been through a pandemic. We've understood Torah differently, right? We've all, and so in that, like, yes, like Jim, to what you're saying, like, we need all these people also, right? I need, right, people who come in and suddenly they've dealt with loss differently than I have. They've had traumas different than I've had, right? Like they see the Torah differently because they've lived a reality, right? So suddenly it says something and they say, oh, of course that makes sense because of this experience that I didn't even know ever existed, right? And I learned more Torah because of that. So yeah, I just say that to say, like, I think you're right. And I am so dissuaded by anyone who says there's any single answer to anything. And I think like it's of all people, I think it's of all times, right? And I think like, right, we pick up, but like the Torah that was taught in the 19th century is different than the Torah that's taught today because we live in a different world. And for me, that's the greatest testimony to the sacredness and the eternal nature of Torah is that it can evolve for all of us for all time.
Am I allowed to be a student of the Jewish Theological Seminary for a moment and challenge the Maharat for a moment on something? Just only because I sort of feel like
if you say there's only one Torah, though, I'm out.
There's two Torahs. No, there's many Torahs. But I want to ask the question of, at least in this teaching, you're presenting as if all of this returns to Sinai, right? It comes from Sinai. Is that really what you mean? Or is Sinai for you a metaphor that it comes from ... fill in the blank? Because as I read this text, right, something happens at Sinai. By the way, it's interesting. We go back to the teaching about the Bira Doleket, it's on fire. Sinai is the place where Moshe encounters the burning bush, right? All of that kind of, I mean, there's so much we could do here, and we're all probably playing those scripts out on our own head. But I want to ask you particularly, Rory, as a representative of the Orthodox community, right? Do you really, is this literal in that sense, right? I'm with you all the way, in this conversation. I just want to ask it, or is it possible that it's earlier than Sinai, and Sinai becomes the manifestation in that moment in time for that particular group of people, and other groups of people could have Sinaitic moments of their own, which are the beginning process of inspiration ledorot for generations?
Yes. I mean, like, really? Like, I mean, I don't know that I have the words to totally say it, but like, for me, it is Sinai. Like, it very much is. But like, I like also that I think what you just like the alternative I think is also true, right? Or Jim, like I think Sinai could be a real place and a place in our imagination, like, right? Because I think for me, like, because it is so real in our tradition, then it's real. Like, I don't know, right? Like, I don't have a time machine, like, right? But I mean, any more than like my great grandparents are real to me, right? Like, and like, of course they're real, like they had to be real because there's pictures and I'm here, right? But like, they exist in my mind and they're two-dimensional in my mind because I never actually met them or interacted with them, right? Like, so I don't know if I'm doing a good job of, but it's like, to me, like Sinai, it's not just allegorical, like it's very much a real place. Like I do think, I do mean this in a very literal way, but I think meaning it in a literal way doesn't mean it can't also be symbolic and metaphorical.
Right, but do you mean both? That was sort of where I was getting at. And if
I
yes,
think
that's
I
great.
make that distinction when I think I say it in a really real way, and I don't think I'm actually being like, I don't think I'm being conscientious to say, because I think like to me it doesn't make a difference, right? Like, the story is the same story regardless, and it's just as real to me regardless. So I don't actually have to make that distinction. And when you ask the question, I'm sort of wrestling, but my answer is like, yes, like I feel it when you say it in this way, and I feel it when you say it in this way, but they're both no less real, and how I live my life doesn't change based on the answers. So I'm not going to lose sleep over it.
Right. I just to quote our teacher, Rabbi Hartman Rabbis, David, he used to say, I don't know if it's real or if it's true, but my Zeta thought it was real and true, and I thought my Zeta was real, or I knew my Zeta was real, so therefore it's real and true. And I think that's since we're in a Hartman setting, I think that's a kind of really a powerful and important teaching that I carry with me. Rabbis, other reactions to the Maharat's commentary? Anything else you wanted to add?
I was going to throw out David Hartman's other teaching that I know about this, which was when people would ask him what his thoughts were on biblical criticism that humans wrote the Bible, he'd say, these aren't interesting questions. Interesting questions are, did Moshe come down and speak with an Ashkenazi or Sephardi accent?
Which the answer is obviously Ashkenaz, just by the way. Like,
well, certainly for David Hartman.
Yeah.
Now, I've agreed with you till now, but I'm absolutely going to disagree with you now. So that's good.
This has been agreed so
far? We want to hear your teaching, Rabbi.
Yes, I'm happy to share as well. Again, I just want to thank my colleagues, because these are just wonderful teachings, and we could probably spend the entire hour on any one of these teachings, and I appreciate it very much. Okay, Rabbi Bogart, if you would be kind enough to share what I would want to share, that's great. Oh, and thank you for whoever put this together. This is a teaching of the late, great Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. And the other day, right before Yom Kippur, my tradition is to read Heschel before Yom Kippur. It's the last thing I read. I put down my sermons and I pick up Heschel, and it's been my long-standing tradition to read a little bit of Heschel. And the other day I shared the beginning God in Search of Man, which probably needs to be renamed God in Search of Human. I'm sure that if Heschel was alive, he would change the name. But this is the end. This is the very end of God in Search of Man. And just, by the way, just to give props to my wife, this is a portrait of Heschel that Polly did as charcoal. This was her charcoal face. It's quite a beautiful rendition of Heschel. And I spent my year of sabbatical, which feels like a lifetime ago, studying Heschel. And my kids, of course, returned from sabbatical, and all they would say whenever Abba was about to open his mouth, they would whisper, Heschel, Heschel, Heschel. Right. So anything Abba's going to say is going to be Heschel, and it's probably true on some level. My dad has a great line that says that every person has 150 words. They spend their whole lifetime just repeating those 150 words with another bunch of words. Okay. So the truth of the matter is that Heschel's teachings have always been very inspirational to me. I still remember as a child, the first time I encountered Heschel really was on a Friday night. I couldn't sleep, and Heschel's books were in the hallway in our home. Shas was on this side facing the doorway, and Heschel was on the bottom or the middle of the shelf at the bottom. And I fell asleep literally with Heschel over my face. But I did a lot of the reading of Heschel on those Friday nights, and I remember that time as very fondly. But here's a selection from Heschel, who was, of course, a theologian, a philosopher, a civil rights activist, died in 1972. World changer, taught, of course, at the Hebrew Union College and then ultimately the Jewish Theological Seminary. So he had a broad swath. It's interesting that I think all the movements on some level claim Heschel as a source of inspiration. My father, who had the opportunity to be at the seminary at that time and study with Heschel, knows that I think people have taken hold of Heschel, and that Heschel himself probably was not respected the way he should have been respected in his lifetime. It's only after the fact that Heschel has gained the kind of reputation that he's gained. And in many ways, Heschel was much more appealing, as Buber was in some level, much more appealing to Christians than to Jews at some points, or to non-Jews than to Jews. But I think, Baruch Hashem, we've reclaimed Heschel as our own. We've collected the leaf that has fallen from the tree, and we've continued to study Heschel. So I thought this was a core text that I could share with you that inspires my rabbinate. We have not chosen God. God, he has chosen us. That in and of itself could be an amazing, powerful statement, right? The notion that it's not really in our ballpark on the one hand to make these determinations, and on the other hand, it really is, but God has chosen us, right? There is no concept of a chosen God, but there is an idea of a chosen people. What a powerful line, right? Like, God is just a reality. At least I think that's the way Heschel felt, right? God is just a reality. And the unbelievable part about this, the mind-blowing part about this, is that God has selected us, right? The idea of a chosen people does not suggest the preference for a people based upon a discrimination among a number of peoples. This is not because God loves us more than God loves other peoples. We do not say that we are superior people, right? It's not that we're better. The chosen people means a people approached and chosen by God, that God has singled us out for some responsibility, some obligation. The significance of this term is genuine in relation to God rather than relation to other peoples, right? It's about the relationship that we have, right? It's not about my relationship with with many people. It's my relationship with you, with the individual. There's something that's happening between these two parties. It signifies not a quality inherent in the people, but a relationship between the people and God. And by the way, it means that we have to be in relationship, right? It means that we have to have a masau matan, a give and a take that happens in that relationship. For me, that's a very important part of this discussion, right? It's not just about a one-way communication. Harassed, pursued with enmity and wronged, our fathers continued to feel joy in being Jews, right? It's not just continue to be Jewish, they felt joy in being Jewish, right? And there's something about this choosing or this selection or this singling out that creates joy. Happier, ashrenu, right? Ashrenu matov chelkenu. How good is our destiny? How pleasant is a lot? How beautiful? Uman naim goralenu, right? How wonderful is our heritage? Right? We say this every morning in the Shacharit service, right? What is the source of that feeling? I think that's the question, right? The quest for immortality is common to all people. To most of them, the vexing question points to the future. Jews think not only of the end, but also of the beginning, right? In other words, we're not looking at Acharit Hayamim, the end of days, right? So at some point in the future, we're sort of looking at it in some kind of holistic way, because really Acharit Hayamim is actually a return to Eden, right? That's what it really is. It's a return to the beginning of time. It's a cyclical reality. As parts of Israel, we are endowed, it's actually say as part of Israel, we are endowed with a very rare, a very precious consciousness, the consciousness that we do not live in a void, right? Our world is not a void. It's not a matter of there's no beginning and no end, or it really doesn't matter. We never suffer from harrowing anxiety and fear of roaming about in the emptiness of time. That's just not a general, at least according to Heschel, Jewish predisposition. We're not just roaming about without something to do. We own the past and hence are not afraid of what will be. We remember where we came from, right? We were summoned and cannot forget it. As we wind the clock of eternal history, we remember the beginning and believe in the end. We live between two historic poles, and that's why I asked you the question, Maharaj, Sinai and the kingdom of God. Because I actually think what Heschel means here is the beginning of at least Jewish time is Sinai, right? Uniquely, even though Daniel pointed out, right, the first 11 chapters are universalistic and then it's particularistic, somehow or another, our real election or real being chosen for our particular role happens at Sinai with the receipt of Torah. Right? And so this, I think, is the conclusion of what Heschel said. There's a line at the end, which I didn't include, which I kind of throws me off. I don't quite understand it. Like a lot of Heschel, I don't quite understand the last line, so I left it off. But I share this notion. We're living between these two poles, right? The Sinai and the kingdom of God. And by the way, just for me at least, what it says is, here's this Torah. It's been given to us. Now let's go make the kingdom of God. But let's not make it somewhere out there. Let's make it here, right? That's the work. And the work is this chosen people has to do the work here in this time, in this place, right? Because that's what we've been chosen to do. And to think about it outside of those Sograim, right? Outside of those two parentheses, creates a reality that is not, I think, consequential for us. It is not like it's, right? It's not up there and it's not down there. It's within this reality that there's enough to do. So for me, this is a really important text, a text that I think I lean on as I think about the work that I'm going to do. And somebody put in the chat earlier, right? Lo alecha amlacha ligmor, right? You can't do all the work, right? On the other hand, you're not free to desist from it. So the question is, what are you going to do with the allotted 120 years that we're given? What are the differences that we're going to try to make? And as a rabbi, I try to live between these two poles, right? The Sinai experience, right? The epiphany, the revelation, and then trying to create a world that moves inches ever closer to the kingdom of God. So that's the teaching that kind of animates my rabbinate, at least at this moment in time. If you ask me to do this exercise next week, I'm sure we'll come up with something different too as well. But reactions, Chaverim.
Thank you for bringing that. First of all, I need to study more Heschel with you because you make it accessible in a way that I don't, I've struggled with at various times. So thank you for that. You know, I'm
just a dear friend of mine just said to me yesterday, said, you keep on talking about Heschel. Every time I open God is so dramatic, I get to the first page and then I'm done and I fall asleep or I can't get through it. So I think that like a lot of things in life, it's just keep on going at it. Keep on going at it. Or what I've started to do is just randomly open a page. Like, don't try to start beginning, middle, and end. Just open a page, and maybe it works. It's just a little suggestion to anybody who's thinking about it.
No, that's great. You know, I'm struck. Like, I'm struck by the text that you brought, and I'm also struck by the way that it interacts with all of our other texts. Like, I feel like there's like themes, you know, and in ways where like we come at this in different ways, but also, you know, so I'm like hearing it, you know, in that, but also, obviously, I think like we're all reflecting through our own lenses and what animates each of us, and I do think though that that Heschel was probably like some of the first time that I actually really started to appreciate like this inverse, right? Like of what was it what is it to actually see humanity as sacred and not only God, right? Or like seeing, that understanding God being in relation to humanity and not all about humanity reorienting itself around God. Because I very much grew up in a world where everything was really oriented around this idea of what we thought that God wanted of us, but also this belief that because it's what God wanted, God can change the world for that, right? But including stories where, like, it was not uncommon for people to tell stories of, they got caught in traffic and it was, Shabbat was going to be starting and they only had 10 minutes to get, wherever it was. And so they were in they drove on the shoulder 80 miles an hour down the highway, right? But it wasn't like in an embarrassed way. That was a very, right, like you were doing God's will and God was watching out for you. And it was only really later that it was like, oh no, that was actually incredibly dangerous. And not considerate of all the other people. And I think, just in terms of my own, right, I think like Heschel was the first one who kind of, for me, was like, that's not what you're supposed to do, right? Like, it's not about, right? Because if I believe that everything is oriented towards God, then it doesn't matter if I put another life in danger, right? I'm doing what God wants. And the realization, like, no, God actually wants you to be doing what's actually for other people, right? And so that's been like a fascinating orientation because that's actually been like a journey that I've been on in my own life. And I'm grateful, with my limited exposure to Heschel, that was sort of like the first time I really heard somebody frame it in that way. And I'm just grateful for the way that you brought this teaching in terms of, I think, really challenging us of these questions of, and I think this balance of like a deep reverence for God, but recognizing that like a deep reverence for God centers a humanity.
Rabbi, I want to thank you, Rory. That was beautiful, and Rabbi Rose, that was beautiful as well. I want to ask you a question by way of, certainly not to challenge the text, because I think I share your reverence for and gratitude for Heschel's teaching and writing and wisdom and inspiration often and regularly. But I do want to push back a little bit about this text. I find it a little ironic, actually, when I understand Heschel, who I see him as a passionate universalist in many ways, believing that, all human beings, all people are valued and important and precious. And yet this text, ironically, of all of his texts, speaks very reverently for Jewish, not only Jewish particularism, but Jewish uniqueness, and I guess to the degree of excluding others from this mission. And I've always believed that Heschel was much more open to others potentially standing there with us, right there with us at Sinai, which argues, for me at least, for the fact that Sinai could not possibly be simply a static moment in history, but it's a constantly recurring, constantly reavailable moment that to which not just the Jews, as a so-called chosen people, have access, but that actually anybody who shares this vision to be summoned, as he puts it, and to not feel that there's a pointlessness to life. But this isn't unique to us. And there's to tie in my text about walking humbly with God, that the arrogance to think that somehow God gave us something that nobody else has access to and nobody else can share it's incomprehensible to me. So I don't know how you can react to that, but
I think it's a great question, number one, and thank you for the reverential way in which you asked the question, both for Heschel and I think for the teaching that I shared. I want to say the following. The more that I've spent time contemplating Heschel, the more I think that, first of all, Heschel was a man of his time, and I say really a man of his time, right? Who writes a book called "On in Search of Man," right? A man of his time. He has to say man. That's number one. Number two, he was ud mutzal me'esh, as a brand plucked from the fire, right? And so he really was living within that reality. The next thing I want to say about Heschel, at least in my reading of Heschel, is that Heschel ultimately could not step outside of himself, right? He could not step outside of himself. He was who he was. He was a scion of Hasidic dynasties, right? He was a person who came from tradition, loved tradition, appreciated all of those things. And as much as he wanted to move into the realm of the universal, and in that sense, I resonate with Heschel. That's what I meant by the brackets, right? It's from Sinai to the kingdom of God. I live and I play in this ballpark, right? Years ago, somebody said to me, it was actually, Yitz Greenberg, and he should continue to live and be strong. But Rabbi Greenberg invited me to come work at Klal. And at the time, he said to me, you'll come, you'll teach in 52 communities, you're spread the Torah all over the place, right? And I said to him, I think I want to be a professional in one place and teach Torah 52 weeks to one community, as opposed to the same Torah 52 different places. I think Heschel, in the end, really felt post-Shoah a responsibility and obligation to remind Jews that we do have a place to play in this pantheon, in this grand rainbow of experiences, right? We have something to offer the world, and to re-energize Jews who really had lost the wind in their sails. And so they needed to feel special about themselves and about their mission and about the passion. And by the way, I'm not so sure the world has changed so much, right? Because all of you, and I'm looking at each of you in the interfaith work that you have done, each of you deserve awards for the work that you do in the interfaith community. And I could go through each of you because I know your stories, and I see the work that you're doing, and it's so inspiring to me. But in the end, you didn't choose just something. You chose Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, Gemara. Like, we come back to this treasure chest. And so for me, the grand thing about Heschel is that Heschel said, you want to be universalist, start somewhere. Start as a home court professional in this, integrate this. And therefore, Heschel could become who he was. He could go to the Vatican, he could have conversations. If he was around today, who would he be talking with, right? He could sit with a Black community and have those conversations of people of faith, because people of faith find a way to be faithful with one another. So I would say that, yes, I can see that the limitation that one could read here. I just think A, he was a man of his time, and B, this is where he started. This was his springboard to do the work that he did. And I think one could argue in the 20th century, there were very few people who made as significant impact on the entire world as Abraham Joshua Heschel. So therefore, he needed to start somewhere and feel secure in where he started. Maybe that's an attempt at an answer. I don't know if it's a good one. Others?
I just want to I just want to emphasize what you just said, because I think that was just so beautifully said. And I think that sometimes, and I know I've fallen into the trap of, right, sometimes when we think about universalism, we think about it in terms of this broadest, right? But there's, right, like you can be firmly in your own lane, even as, right, universalism is about kind of how you see the rest of the world, not necessarily how you see yourself. And I think sometimes,
Beautiful.
right, because people will push back, or they'll say, right, so if you believe in all of these truths, right, but and whether, to even go back to what you said before, right, for me, some of it, right, is because this is what my grandparents did, or this is my belief, whatever it is, right, for whatever reason we find ourselves where we are, doesn't mean that we have to water down or be everything just because we can embrace everyone. And I deeply appreciate that model that you're lifting up from Heschel in that.
Yeah.
This model and what we're playing with the universal in particular, I'm struck. I've never thought of it through this lens before, but and Carney, perhaps you can tell us whether this is apocryphal or not, but the story I've always heard about Heschel, that, he comes over on one of these special visas that was meant to rescue sort of the great scholars of Europe. And he comes over and he lands at whatever port of entry he was at. And he looks around at the entry place, and he sees that all of the shoe shiners are Black and all the people being serviced are white. He says, so these are the Jews of America. And I'm just struck by how particular of a starting point that is for a universal kind of message, right? He was using our story, the Jewish story, as a lens for understanding the world around him.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Heschel has this wonderful, notion of Moshe standing before Pharaoh, right? Before Paro, Isn't that the reality of his time as well and ours today, right? Standing before a king or before the man or before the establishment and challenging and saying, let people go, let people be free. So I think that the biblical language, right, is a language that is our safa. It's the language that we speak. We know that it's not the only language, right? But we know it's the language that we own. And so it's the way in which we talk amongst ourselves, right? And it's particularly nice to be able to do that with colleagues because we don't have to translate the idiom. Each of us gets it immediately. But that's not true in every setting. And so as much as Heschel's writings are greatly, this is worth the whole session just to see this love. But as much as we appreciate, I think, or I appreciate what Heschel is saying and wanted to share with you today, I think we also understand that what has to happen is we need a translation of Heschel, like a super commentary. We need a Rashi for Heschel into this era. And the sad part is that the person who might be able to do it might be Susanna Heschel, right? Maybe. And on some level, I think she has started to do that, but we don't have a super commentary for Heschel. And in that sense, right, all of us claim Heschel. It's interesting because for a while the conservative movement, had Heschel. He was at HUC and he called it the loneliest period in his life, right, in a cafeteria that wasn't kosher, and all those stories that may be apocryphal, may be true. I think they are true. Okay, that he felt that way. But at the seminary, by the way, his office was 613. That was an office number for Heschel. And Kaplan had an office on the same floor, on the 6th floor of the seminary, right? And these two people, if you know anything about Mordechai Kaplan and Abraham Joshua Heschel, like two worlds, right? And the institution was able to sustain it. Yet neither one of them really fully felt accepted within that institution. Who won out? The Talmudists. Who won out? The historical school, right? The positive historical school. Neither of these orientations. So I think it's interesting. Yet I would say that the person who really inspired Heschel the most is King, right? And why? Because he spoke the same idiom almost, right? Not in Ashkenazi pronunciation, right? But he spoke it in Christian pronunciation, in the Christian language, his utilization of the Bible, right? Heschel would look at inspired African American Black leaders and say, these are the Nevi'im. These are the prophets of our time. That's, I think, the kind of super commentary that we need. And to go back just to Daniel, your comments earlier, right? Like these causes are the causes that Heschel would have made his cause celeb. And they're the causes, therefore, that we need to engage in. But I'm taking a step back in the text and bringing it this way, and where I started, which was, I think we need to re-energize our own people to understand that we have a treasure chest. And that treasure chest includes all of the things that we've talked about here. But if we could just get people to appreciate the treasure that we've got, then they could then potentially apply it in other ways. And I think many of you are far further ahead in your application of the universalistic elements of Torah. Reb Zalman used to say, I want to get it right. He used to say, I'm a generic practitioner of a particularistic religion, right? I think that's it. Like Zalman got there. Reb Zalman got there, right? I'm just aspiring to get there, right? I'm hoping to get there on some level. But if I don't, my mom always used to say, you can shoot for the stars because the worst case scenario is you'll hit the sky. I'm just aspiring to hit the sky a little bit and to get to have an ilui, a raising up of people in our own community, within our own sograyim, within our own parentheses. And maybe that's just ani hakatan, right?
Which is why tonight we're going to look through the schach of the sukkah at the sky and hope to see a little bit of the stars. Yeah. And you've given us incredible, beautiful Torah to take there. So Thank you.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Are there any questions from the people out there? Maybe we should take a few questions, unless anybody has a last word that we'll give everybody a last word on the way out, but we have about 10 minutes. So are there any questions out there that people wanted to ask us? My mom says, didn't MLK do the same thing with text? Yes, use it to animate and highlight the struggle as manifested. They shared a language of experience. Yes, absolutely. What's interesting, by the way, though, I think, Heschel lived, how do we say this in the right way? I sense that Heschel still lived in the shtetl. Like he actually lived all of moments. I think he lived at Sinai too. Like he really lived in those moments the way that King was actually living it out in his own experience. He was really in the midst of the struggle. And I think Heschel had this unique quality as if he was really in those moments in history, as if he was standing at Sinai, as if he was standing before the king of Egypt, right? I think he was standing at the burning bush. I think Heschel had lived in that reverential, wondrous kind of way. Um, I'm jealous of that. I would love to live as if it's really happening, and I need that animation. Maybe some of you have that.
I think just to like one of my favorite things to that I've had the privilege of studying is so I haven't always done all of Heschel's text, right? But you referenced Heschel going to the Vatican, which I believe was like Erev Yom Kippur or some like ridiculous day. But what's really fascinating to me, because I became interested when I started getting involved in interfaith work with reasons why the Orthodox community was less involved. And in the modern Orthodox community, they all quote Rav Soloveitchik's essay, confrontation. But so I delved into some research, and what's really interesting is that Soloveitchik and Heschel are actually like they have very similar life paths, right? So Soloveitchik being one of the great modern Orthodox rabbis, he's at Yeshiva University. He like ordains more rabbis than anybody else in the history. He's just called the Rav. But I think they might have even been distant cousins. They come from like a similar place in Eastern Europe. They both get their PhD in Germany, and both managed to escape the war and make it to the U.S. Soloveitchik goes to YU. Heschel ultimately lands at JTS. But they both get invited to participate in this dialogue with the Vatican. And I think this actually kind of goes back to, Daniel, maybe where you started us out, because what becomes really interesting is that Soloveitchik's attitude is like, right, what he says in confrontation was basically like, his like too soon is essentially, I think, confrontation, right? He sort of says like, we just escaped from the horrors of Europe and we're not going to pretend like we can have a conversation as equals. Like that's not where we are right now, and we're not going to engage in this. But Heschel does. I mean, Heschel decides to take action. And what's fascinating is that, Heschel responds really strongly to what the Vatican is trying to create a document about Jews. It's actually really offensive in their first draft of it. Heschel writes like a scathing response, and you see Heschel's words show up in the final draft. And there's something I think also to that tension where Soloveitchik is sort of saying like, I can't be part of this, and Heschel I think feels this need to say no. I'm going to go on Erev Yom Kippur and I'm going to meet with the Pope and I'm going to tell him why he has completely gotten this theology wrong about Jews and he needs to change it. But he changes the course of history for it. And I don't know, because I also, I have a love for Soloveitchik. I think Soloveitchik writes Lonely Man of Faith. I think there's a loneliness that I think we feel in Heschel also, right? Like, I think there's this like conversation, there's this beauty between these two men. It's interesting, Rav Moshe Feinstein, the great ultra-Orthodox leader, also, there's like what to unpack in all of it. But actually, it takes me back to where Daniel started us of saying, like, there's something to be said for seeing it, but there's something to be said for also acting on it. And I think that's part of like, what's so profound to me about Heschel is that he sees it, but then he goes into the mess, right? It's not an easy place to be, but he sits in it.
Yeah, that's beautiful. By the way, Reuven Kibbelman, our teacher, our colleague, Rabbi Reuven Kibbelman, wrote an article about Heschel and Soloveitchik. I think it's like
it's a
2004, 2005, somewhere in there, but it's worthwhile. And much of what you say is in that article as well. And
I think really I probably got much of what I said from that article.
I said it before, Hagonev me'aganav patur, you took it from somebody else. But I think it's quite beautiful what it is that you're saying. And it's interesting to me that on some level, and I don't know how we feel as rabbis, right? Just to bring it back to our own rabbinates, but this notion of being a lonely person of faith, to have some sense that there are times when we think the whole world is Meshuggah. Remember that great story about the tainted wheat? Do you remember this story? Heschel actually brings the story, right? The story is that there's a kingdom, right? And everybody knows that the wheat is tainted. And if you eat the wheat, you're going to become Meshuggah like everybody else, right? And so finally, the king and his advisors, right, they decide that they have to eat because otherwise they're going to die. So what do? They all put a mark on their forehead, right? And they say to one another, when you eat the wheat and become Meshuggah, we're the only ones who are going to know that we're Epis Meshuggah, that we're crazy. but at least we'll know that we're crazy where the rest of the world doesn't know they're crazy. Like on some level, these very lonely characters understood that a lot of particularly American or North American Jewry, right, outside European Jewry, at least for them, didn't get it. I think we sometimes as rabbis, I'll speak for myself, I shouldn't speak for anybody else, but for myself, I sometimes think we get it, right? And we sometimes have a hard time explaining it, probably, at least in my case, not in your case, is that I'm not articulate enough to really get it across, or I'm not passionate enough, or people don't take me seriously enough, or whatever it is, right? That I just can't get it across. But I think many people of faith feel that way. And that's why I actually think we are drawn to one another, because we all have that little mark on our forehead to say, Epis, we are Meshuggah, right? But the truth is we're not the real Meshuggahs. It's the rest of the world that doesn't see this kind of stuff that's Meshuggah. It's the rest of the world that doesn't see that there is the numinous. There's the rest of the world that doesn't see that there's a power beyond us. There's the rest of the world that doesn't see that we are called upon to make a difference in the world. It's the rest of the world that really doesn't see that all religions are reflections of the divine, right? It's those people become small as opposed to those who are trying to think big. And I think that's one of the great challenges. And these kind of texts that we've all shared take us out of that place. At least it's so freeing for me to hear us talk about our dreams, our aspirations, our ikarim, our essential values, but also they don't stay there. It doesn't make us smaller. It makes us bigger. Your Torah enhances my Torah. My Torah hopefully adds something to your Torah. Last words, we've got a few moments.
My last word is just amen. That was beautiful.
Amen.
Amen. This was great.
Okay. Maharat Rory, anything you want to add? Right.
So we'll be back next month.
We will be, and next month we'll be doing something I'm sure really interesting. We don't know what it is yet. So in the chat, if you would be so kind, folks, as to put something out there that you'd like us to think about. I want to just finish again with a special thank you to the Hartman Institute. And I said this at the beginning of the session the last time when we got disrupted, but you know, disruptive innovation is really cool these days anyway, right? Clayton Christensen said so, right? But because it led to this and it gave me more time to think about what I hoped the session would, and it far exceeded my expectations. But I want to say that Hartman really gave us some training wheels, you know? And that's what I thought I got at Hartman. I realized also that Hartman has given us wings. And it's an orientation. It's a way in which to look at the world, look at Jewish texts, look at Jewish tradition, and to look beyond Jewish tradition. And I just want to thank and bless the Hartman Institute to continue to do that, because I really do believe that it's Ashreinu Matov Chelkenu. We have very, very, very fortunate to have had the opportunity, and some of us continue to have the opportunity to study. Don't worry, you'll get there. You'll be a senior scholar. You'll get the gray hair by then. It's okay. Daniel, maybe you'll have a gray hair. You have gray beard. It's good. But the absolute zechut that we have to live in this time and this place, and to have had the nourishment from the Hartman Institute. And so I want to acknowledge that and make sure that we share that ongoing gift with the world, right? No Torah is worth its weight in anything, chicken schmaltz, unless you share it with somebody. So I really appreciate the opportunity to share it. And so, there's a question that someone gets the last word. Oh, can't you just do more of this once a month? We intend to do more of this once a month. The question is, what will be the next one?
We do all the time, all of us.
I was going to say, you can hear, we all talk nonstop. You can find,
right.
Absolutely. Well, I think also just to wish everybody a Chag
Sameach,
a wonderful Sukkot. And Carney, thank you so much. Thank you for this gift that you've given all of us.
Thank you to each of you, our gifts to each of you. So thank you all. And maybe somebody put in the chat, maybe we should look at different Jewish thinkers and maybe share some of our favorite texts from.
Beautiful.
If you want me to talk about Heschel, Feinstein, and Soloveitchik, I can do that for hours.
I'm sorry, you only get the Rambam. And you get 10 minutes.
Yeshayahu Leibowitz too.
For
and
sure.
Hartman and come on, yeah.
It was like a big thing in Brooklyn, where I'm from. They just Cyclones is the Mets farm team. They just renamed the stadium Maimonides Stadium.
Wow.
It's after
Wow.
Maimonides Hospital, not after
But
the man.
still.
The hospital's named after the man.
Details.
Somebody told me we have to do Borgia. That's what they just said. We have
Yeah,
to
I
do
like
Borgia.
Borgia.
There you go. Okay, Zygazit,
Chag
everybody.
Sameach,
Thank you.
everyone.
Chag
Chag
Sameach. Modim
Sameach.
Simcha. You have to be happy. It's Sukkot. You have to be happy. It's a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah.
Absolutely. And thank you, Autumn. Thank you for all your hard work behind the scenes.
Thank you, Autumn. I got to tell you, I wish we could see your face. I mean, the Vogards are really cute, but you have got a good face too. Very good. Lehitraot, everybody. Thank you.
Chag
Thank you. Thank you.
Sameach.
Be well.
Bye,
Thank
guys.
you.
Sameach.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Lehitraot.